What's up everyone, it's my Chua and welcome to my channel. 2022 is officially over and it has been such a wonderful reading year for me. I was able to surpass my reading goal and I've read over 140 books this year. Out of all of these books, I decided to narrow down my favorites to the top 10 books of 2022. Obviously, there were so many great books that I've read this year, but it wasn't that difficult for me to narrow it down to my top 10. And that's because I'm actually very picky about my ratings and I don't give out 5-star ratings that easily. I was debating if I wanted to do like a countdown from my 10th favorite to my first, or if I just want to throw them all in there and call them all my favorites. But I did decide that it would be more challenging and fun if I did rank them in order. And so with that said, let's get on to my top 10 books of 2022. Coming in number 10, I have a duet, and obviously this is a little bit cheating, right, because it's 2 books and not just 1. However, the series that I do include in this video usually follow just one couple throughout, or one main character throughout the whole series. Because I feel like if you're following the same couple or like the same main character, you do have to complete all of the books to actually get the whole romance. And so I'm not like including like all of the companion novels to a series or anything like that. Alright, so back to number 10, I have Full Tilt and All In, right? So this is a duet and it's by Emma Scott. So I've heard about this duet from like last year even, and I did forget about it until recently. But I'm glad that it's one that I did come back to because I absolutely loved both of these books. This duet features a second chance at love romance, right? So it's not necessarily like our main characters having a second chance to be together, but it's more like our main character finds love for the first time and she gets another love later on, okay? So our main character is called Casey and we're pretty much following her love life throughout these 2 books. At the start of book 1, we find out that Casey is this lead guitarist for this up-and-coming rock star band. And so she's living her life, she's also like partying a lot and making very reckless decisions. After a concert that their band performs at, Casey actually ends up getting very shit-faced, right? And so she's like immediately sent home. However, when she wakes up in the morning, she doesn't remember anything that happened the previous night, right? And she wakes up in a stranger's house. This stranger that she meets for the first time is actually her limo driver, and that is our hero Jonah. I don't want to give too much away, but essentially this is like a romance between 2 very different people who have such different perspectives of life, right? And so this was such a heart-wrenching and emotional book, and if I were to compare this to any other book that I've read, I would say it's very similar to A Thousand Boy Kisses by Tilly Cole. And so I'm gonna leave it at that, but you do have to read the second book to get the happily ever after ending. Next, coming in at number 9, I have Hookshot by Kennedy Ryan, and this is her 3rd book in the Hoop series. So I absolutely love the first book to this series as well. I would highly recommend you read that one first. In this book, we're following Lotus and Keenan, and they are introduced in the first book as well, but we find out that our 2 main characters come with a whole lot of baggage. Keenan is a divorced single dad, and I believe he's like the lead of his basketball team or something. So this is obviously a sports romance, and he just has a lot of issues from his past, like mainly revolving his ex-wife. Like she just does not make his life any easier. Lotus, on the other hand, is a very closed-off person, right? Especially with her love life. And we find out that she has like all of these family issues going on, and she does have this traumatic past as well. So you can tell that both our characters have a lot on their plates. However, even from the first time that they met each other, they were both very drawn to each other, right? And in this book, we're following how their relationship progresses and how they have to make all of these sacrifices just to be together. I just thought that the relationship was very well developed. Like they both have very mature discussions about their wants and their needs, and so you can just tell that these 2 were meant to be together. There was also a scene in this book that just broke me, right? It was so emotional and I remember it to this day. So highly recommend this book. Alright, so coming at number 8 is a book that I read like at the very beginning of 2022, and right when I finished reading it, I knew that it was going to be one of my top 10 favorites of this year. And so that book is called Still Bleeding by Jennifer Hartmann. So this book kind of starts off as like an enemies to lovers situation, right? So we're following Dean and Cora, and they always had this relationship where they're always bickering and like pulling all of these little pranks on each other. This is a dark romance, so definitely check out the triggers, and it is also a taboo romance because Dean is actually Cora's older sister's fiance. At the start of this book, everybody is at this bar or something, right? And they're like celebrating Cora's older sister's birthday. As everybody else decides to leave, Cora decides that she wants to stay back and enjoy just a few more drinks or so. When she finally decides to leave, she realizes that somebody stole her wallet, so she can't really catch a ride home. And Dean happens to be the only person who would pick up her calls. So Dean ends up picking up Cora from the bars, right? However, on their way home, they both get attacked and then kidnapped together. This is not a lighthearted book. We do spend a good chunk of the book with them in the kidnapper's basement, and so they're forced to do things that they're not willing to do. And after all of the things that they've gone through together, they both start to trauma bond, and so that event forever has changed their lives and changed their relationship as well. I promise this book is so worth the read. Like, it by no means is easy to read, right? But you do really fall in love with the character development in this book, and you realize that both our main characters need each other to heal from the trauma. And so definitely go pick up this book. Coming in at number 7, I have The Silent Waters by Brittainy. And in this book, we're following the relationship between Maggie and Brooks all the way from when they're kids to their adult years. So as kids, Maggie always had this crush on Brooks, right? And I want to say that they were neighbors or something, but I could be wrong. However, Brooks was Maggie's older brother's best friend, so they pretty much grew up together. One day, Maggie proposes to Brooks that they get married, and she wants it done at this pond or this swamp that they always go and play at. On their wedding day, Brooks is actually late to their meeting spot, and so Maggie goes there by herself, and she ends up witnessing something very horrible. Ever since then, Maggie is extremely traumatized, so she refuses to go outside of her house, and she also loses her ability to speak. Now, this book does have some triggers as well. We see both Maggie and Brooks overcoming their traumas together, and I just absolutely adore their relationship. They've always been it for each other, and you can feel that they have such a special connection, from the way that they can communicate to each other to the way that they understand each other. Like, nobody else understands them more than they understand each other, and that just makes this such an amazing book. It was such an emotional book as well, and I am realizing that I like these emotional, trauma-filled books, and I don't know what that says about me, but I absolutely just eat these books up. On the flip side, I have coming up at number 6 a series, and this is called the Wolf Hotel series by Nina West, also known as K.A. Tucker. So this is a very spicy and smutty series. You do get a lot of smut in the first book, but I promise it gets even better and spicier as you read throughout the series. In this series, we're following Abby, who grew up in this small town. Her family is very reserved and religious as well. So knowing Abby, she's also very inexperienced, she's naive, and she's a virgin heroine. At the beginning of this book, we find out that Abby was engaged to this boy that she had this relationship with for a while, right? And so they were gonna be married and everything, but Abby finds out that he had cheated on her, and so now she's kind of feeling lost in life. After getting betrayed, she decides that things have got to change and she needs to move out of this small town. And so she does decide to take on this position in Alaska, working for this very famous hotel chain. During her time there, she realizes that everything from the outside world is very different from where she's from. And there she meets this hot billionaire CEO guy from the Wolf Hotels chain, and that is our Mr. Henry Wolf. So obviously we have Mr. Henry Wolf, who is this very experienced person in sexual relationships, and he meets Abby, who's very naive, and he wants to be the person to show her the way. Eventually, Abby starts feeling things she's never felt before, all of these emotions, and she's also ready to kind of explore more of her sexuality. That is a very typical setup to a romance book, right? But I promise that is just book number 1. And so if you move on to book number 2 and continue on to book number 4, you will see why this is one of my top 10 books of this year. Alright, so going on to number 5, I have the ACOTAR series by Sarah J. Maas, and I'm talking specifically about the first 3 books in this series. We all obviously know that this series is very, very well loved, and so this is my introductory to fantasy romances. Feyre is our main character in this series, and she comes from a very poor family. Like, they literally have to hunt for their own food just so they don't die from starvation. One day, Feyre goes out hunting, and she ends up killing this wolf that she later finds out is a fairy just taking on a wolf form. Later that night, Feyre is sought out by another very strong fairy, and he tells her that she has to repay her debt by following him back to the Fae world, which we know as Prythian. Otherwise, he's gonna murder her whole family. Of course, Feyre is reluctant, but she doesn't want her family to die, so she follows him back to Prythian. And once she is there, she realizes that her life is forever changed. Obviously, that was just a setup to the story. Like, there's so much more going on. There's a whole lot of world building and character development in this series. I would highly recommend this for new fantasy romance readers. Coming in at number 4, I have The Takeover by T.L. Swan, and this is actually the second book to the Miles High Club series. In this book, we're following Claire, who is a widow and also a mother of 3 wild sons. At the beginning of this book, we see that Claire and her late husband had formed this company together, and she is currently struggling to keep their business alive. Tristan, who is our hero in this book, is somebody who takes over smaller companies, right? So he's trying to buy out Claire and her late husband's business. Obviously, Claire is very offended by this, right? So they both start off on the wrong foot. Several months later, they both attend this conference in France, and even though they didn't like each other at first, they obviously can't deny their attraction towards one another. From there, we see that their little intimate relationship that they started in France definitely did not stay in France, and it followed them back home. I think what got me in this book is the fact that Tristan not only was courting Claire, but he also had to win over her 3 sons as well. Her kids were not all like children. Like, we did have a child, we had a teenager, and then we had one in college. So I really appreciate the relationships that Tristan had to form with each of her sons. I absolutely just fell in love with T.L. Swan's writing as well. Like, her humor was just top par, and her banter and everything was just superb. Like, I just absolutely adored all of the characters in this book. On to number 3, I have a book that was super emotional. It was so depressing. Like, it hurted me so much to read, but I think that might be the reason why I loved it so much. So this one is called One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. In this book, we're following Emma, and she is happily married to her high school love, who we know as Jesse. They build this very beautiful relationship together, doing everything that they love and not caring about the expectations of others. Everyone knows how inseparable the two are. However, as their first wedding anniversary is coming up, Jesse actually flies across the Pacific Ocean on this work trip, and suddenly his helicopter goes missing. Just like that, Jesse is presumed dead, and their perfect marriage becomes a very devastating loss. Emma obviously has no other choice than to move on with her life. Several years later, she reunites with this old friend who we know as Sam, and he just might be the person to give her a second chance at love. Reluctantly, Emma does find herself falling in love again with Sam, right? And eventually they do get engaged. However, just as things are starting to look bright again for Emma, she receives this phone call from somebody very, very familiar, and that person happens to be Jesse. So you can see all of the difficult decisions that Emma had to make in this book, right? While reading this book, I had no clue who she was going to pick, but either way, somebody was going to get hurt. Either way, she could only have one of them. Definitely pick up this book if you want something to pull at your heartstrings and if you want to feel all of the feels. Alright, so down to my top 2 books. Okay, so I do have at number 2 a sequel, and that is called Binding 13 and Keeping 13 by Chloe Walsh. Not gonna lie, these 2 books were so long, but they were worth every single minute reading them. Anyways, we have a very alpha male hero who's called Johnny, and he is also a popular rugby player. Then we have Shannon, who is this very shy girl who used to get bullied a lot in school. So obviously she's really closed off and she doesn't have a lot of friends. She doesn't trust anybody easily. Now we have 2 very different people who actually use their differences to confide in each other and eventually fall in love. Now obviously these books are super long, and so this is a very slow burn romance. This is not a lighthearted story. Like, there were a lot of scenes that were very very, very hard to read, but I do think that they were very important to the main plot as well. You also get so invested in the side characters as well. Like by the end of book 2, you feel like you made this whole friend group and you're not ready to let them go. This sequel was so emotional and the story was so beautifully done. Like you sympathize with each one of these characters, and I cannot stress enough how good this sequel was. Finally, on to number 1. Okay, so this series takes the top for my top 2022 reads of the year. And so if you've been with me for a while, you probably already know what this is, but it is definitely none other than the Mindf series by St. Abby. Ever since finishing this series, like I talk about this all the freaking time, I would recommend the series to everyone, okay? Even if you're not a romance reader, I think you would love this series regardless. If I were to gift any book to anybody, it would be this series, okay? This is a chef's kiss perfection in my opinion. This series consists of 5 separate books, but each one of those books are only like about 100 or so pages, right? So you can just combine them all into one book. This book follows Lana Myers, and she again had this very traumatic past. A whole lot of horrible things have happened to her, and she is ready for revenge. So this is a very revenge plot heavy book. Lana is obviously very closed off, she is very secretive, and she doesn't trust anybody easily. One day she is at this coffee shop and she meets our hero Logan. However, Logan is this detective, right? And he seems to be able to read her like a book. This definitely makes Lana nervous, right? Because Lana is a serial killer and Logan happens to be the detective on her case. Now you can see where the conflict lies, because Lana is on this very important mission, and while doing so, she does find herself falling in love with Logan. Obviously, this complicates their whole relationship because Logan is trying to find this serial killer, not realizing that she's been by his side the whole time, okay? Technically, this is not a spoiler, right? Because you do know the setup going into the series, but pretty much throughout the series, you just kind of follow how things are going to be revealed. This is obviously number 1 for a reason, right? I could not get enough of this series, and I already want to go back for another reread. I do have to say, Logan is very swoon-worthy, and he's the perfect book boyfriend. But Lana is the one who carries the story, okay? She is a badass bitch, and she's the anti-hero, but you love her regardless. Alright, so those were the top 10 books of 2022 in my opinion. I would also love to know your thoughts on these books as well. If you agree or if you disagree, if there's one in particular that you really liked, or if there's one that you really didn't like. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for being here. As always, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next year. Bye bye.